This video is going to be about the things that I miss about the 90s. Now, there are a lot of things I miss about the 90s, and one of the things I liked about the 90s is about political correctness. Um, Political correctness wasn't so rampant as it is nowadays. What people refer to as political correctness, I refer to as oversensitivity. And we didn't have a lot of that in the 90s. People just said things like they were, and nobody was politically correct, which is fine because I was the same way too. And just keep this in mind. I was a little kid. I wasn't even like 10 years old yet. I think I should say this now, but my favorite thing about the '90s was we didn't have social media back then. Social media is so mind numbing, and something like Facebook, I consider it evil. And because it's like back then, people didn't just talk through social media all the time. And if we ever wanted to keep in touch, we would use the house phones, a cell phone for some of us who could actually afford it. And another thing that I liked about the 90s is that if you wanted to send a message over the internet, we would use emails. And everybody was using America Online, broadband dial up, where whoever was on the internet, the phone lines were occupied. Now, that was actually pretty cool. So I think emails is the best method of communication, in my opinion. Social media is very mind numbing and it just creates this illusion and creates these silly trends. It gives you this illusion of glamour, which I find so mind numbing and I don't like it. So that's one of the many things I really miss about the 90s, actually. No social media. Social media sucks. I'm much against it. Third point, what I also loved about the 90s was that times were simpler, not just for me as a child, but for my family members as well. Um, as far as the economy goes, the economy was much better in the 90s. I mean, gas prices were 99 cents a gallon, a buck and 5 cents, $1.05 a gallon, and what, $1.12 for diesel fuel or something like that. Gas prices were much cheaper back then, much more affordable. Actually, gas prices were about 60 cents a gallon at one point. So, yeah, that's another thing I liked about the 90s where gas prices were actually much, much cheaper. The economy was good too. Back then, you were able to get a job that pays $8 an hour, and that was enough to feed a family of three. You can't even do that nowadays. If you're supporting a family of three, you might need 2 to 3 jobs. Sucks. And I feel like watching movies was more exciting back then, simply because, in those days, we didn't have like Netflix and all these other things. We didn't have Netflix and Amazon and Hulu. Our Netflix back then was going to the store and rent a movie, whether it was from Hollywood Video or Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video doesn't exist. It only exists in only one state. And I miss those days very much. It was very fun, very exciting. And and the same thing goes with and we didn't have Redbox back then. And as far as renting video games, straight to Blockbuster or Hollywood Video. It was much better back then. I actually preferred it. And nowadays you just download video games and it has to use Wi-Fi. It's a bit much. That's why it was better back then to when it comes to video games and movies. It was better back then because you can actually go to the store and rent. Gives you an excuse to get out of the house, in my opinion. Oh yeah, sports were more exciting to watch back then. I mean, I can say the same thing about sports entertainment. And I think the 90s was a great time for me because I actually went to go to WCW and the WWE, which was known as the WWF, twice in both of those in both arenas, WCW and WWE. And it was more exciting to watch back then. Athletes were more exciting back then. Anywhere from like guys from Michael Jordan to other athletes like Ken Shamrock. I mean, guys were fun to watch on TV. Sports is not as exciting as it used to be. I can say that much. Cartoons were also better. Kids shows like Sesame Street was also much better as well. They were more educational, and they're not as educational today. Music was definitely better, especially when it comes to trance music, techno music, and hip hop. They're not as good as they used to be. They're not as intense, and hip hop nowadays has really gone down, the garbage. You know, um, the lyrics are not as genuine, and they don't have storytelling abilities anymore. Not like the good old artists like Tupac and Nas and Big Pun and what have you. Nowadays, they have these artists named the Boogie with the Hoodie, some weird name like that. But anyway, yeah, and then you have Soldier Boy. That's another lame artist. Cartoons were better for kids back then too. A lot of them actually had messages that even adults could relate to, and and I can name you a whole list, but that might be for another video, or if you send me messages. Even TV in itself was more creative back then. That's another thing I liked about the 90s. Yeah, and back then in the 90s, I don't think everybody had to like scramble for money as much nowadays, like you do nowadays, where everybody's just working and they're busy and no one seems to have time for themselves. It's another thing. And like I said, back then you could, you know, you didn't even have to go to high school. You could actually drop out of high school and have a low paying job, and you could support yourself with that. You can't do that anymore. Oh yeah, the comedians back then were actually a lot funnier as well. Anywhere from Dave Chappelle to I guess you could say Chris Rock and Jim Carrey, of course. And the list goes on and on. So yeah, I think that coincides with TV and entertainment. Back then it was actually making friends was better back in the 90s. People when people talk to friends, they just talk on social media. They just keep texting on the phones. They're always on their phones 24/7 sending messages, and they're always typing something on Facebook, sending a message. And I feel like social media just, it deters you from having a real social interaction. But back then, like you could make friends with anybody. It was much easier to make friends with people. I mean, whether it was at a workplace, whether it was at school, at the library, or wherever it was, everybody made friends with one another. And people actually had a real social interaction. But nowadays, when I talk to people in person, they're always on their phone messing around or trying to send a message to somebody or something. They always have to type something while they're on the phone. It becomes a distraction. This is why I'm actually going to go back to flip phones, and this is why I actually don't like talking on the phone, because it's just not real as face-to-face interaction. Oh yeah, divorce rates also weren't as high as they are nowadays. The 90s was really not that bad when it comes to divorce rates. I mean, it was getting pretty bad, but not like it is nowadays. Divorce back then was not a trend. Divorce nowadays, it is. In the 90s, people had better family values back then. That's another thing I liked about the 90s. Um, and that's one other aspect. In retrospect, I think the 90s was better for people who were religious, because a lot of religious people, they are strongly against gay marriage, and in the 90s that's something unheard of, and nobody was able to come out of the closet back then. So for religious people, I felt like it was kind of a better environment, because most of them are against gay marriage, and I think this is better for them. Of course, I've always been indifferent about the whole homosexuality thing, so I couldn't care less. Oh, another thing is that I know people still play video games, but looking back on it, I think video games were better back then. They didn't always require Wi-Fi and just to play a video game, especially one that you download. Um, Back then, like you actually had to like buy a game and actually play it, and I felt like it was more fun because you could actually interact with people. And back then, like people always say like, "Hey, I bought this new game." Then friends are like, "Oh, can I come over to your house?" Then everybody would just start playing, and I feel like it was better back then. I mean, in terms of entertainment, watching TV and playing video games, it was a whole lot better back then. Also in the 90s, growing up, I spent most of my time outside playing with friends. whether it was with my cousins or it was with my closest friends. And I'm talking about the first friends that I've ever made when I moved to the United States from Africa. And yeah, and people would always more kids were playing outside, whether it's in the playground or playing touch football. That was the thing to do for kids in the 90s. And tree climbing, yeah, I did all of that. That was the thing to do back then. But nowadays, you don't see that as much. Kids playing outside. I mean, when I see that sometimes it makes me happy because most kids nowadays are just zombies who, spend most of their time playing on their phone, playing video games and staying inside the house and never leaving the house. It's kind of a waste, honestly. It's a waste of your own brain, so, you know. That's another thing I loved about the 90s. I really missed the 90s. Those are the best years of my life. So anyhow, I think that's as much as I can say about the things that I miss about the 90s. In retrospect, if I had a time machine right now, I would definitely go back and relive the 90s over and over and over again. Those were very fun times, very fun years, and I've experienced a lot of fun stuff there. Yeah, I've traveled to other countries when I was a kid. Don't have a lot of memories on that. Yeah, I mean, my brother was nice enough to get me tickets to go to WCW and WWF, which is now known as the WWE, and I got to see a lot of cool wrestlers from Rey Mysterio to Kevin Nash, Hulk Hogan, got Hulk Hogan's autograph. I mean, the 90s were a great time for me. So yeah, those were the things back then, that I missed about the 90s. Oh yeah, and if you didn't have a phone on you, payphones were everywhere were there everywhere you went in every street corner. They got rid of most of them. The only last time I saw a payphone, the last time I saw payphones were it was in New York City. Whenever my cell phone died, I would try to use a payphone, but that one didn't work. But it was always there as an emergency. It was super convenient. I love that. That's another thing I miss about the 90s so much. I mean, it's always there in case of emergency. I mean, what if your cell phone dies? I think payphones should still exist. If you don't have a cell phone, you don't know how to get in contact with anybody else. And if you memorize a phone number, then you could be like, hey, it's like put a quarter in, you do this, and it gives you 30 seconds to say something to another person if that person doesn't respond. And this is how we used to text back then. You had 15 to 30 seconds to say something, and all of a sudden you'd have to say it as fast as you can. Then all of a sudden you'd have to hang up. It's kind of funny, but in retrospect, as corny as that sounds, I actually enjoyed that. Oh, I forgot to mention another thing. Not only did we use emails back then when we wanted to send messages to people who we wanted to keep in touch with, but even in the 90s, we sent letters. Like we wrote on a piece of paper, licked the adhesive on the envelope, and then we just put a stamp on it, and then we send it at the mailbox. Put it in the mailbox, and then it would be sent to the address. This is another way we would send messages, and I remember seeing that at one point. And oh boy, I just miss the 90s, man. But anyway, thanks for sharing. You can put what you remember and what you miss about the 90s, and I don't know. Please feel free to share. Peace.